Our second scripture today is from the book of Exodus. And it's a long reading, but I felt like it needed pretty much the whole story. Chapter 16, verses 4 to 26. Then the Lord said to Moses, I'm going to rain bread from heaven for you. And each day the people shall go out and gather enough for that day. In that way I will test them whether they will follow my instruction or not. On the sixth day, when they prepare what they bring in, it will be twice as much as they gather on the other days. So Moses and Aaron said to all the Israelites, in the evening you shall know that it was the Lord who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and in the morning you shall see the glory of the Lord, because he has heard your complaining against the Lord. For what are we that you complain against us? Moses said, when the Lord gives you meat to eat in the evening and your fill of bread in the morning, because the Lord has heard the complaining that you utter against him, what are we? Your complaining is not against us, but against the Lord. Then Moses said to Aaron, say to the whole congregation of Israelites, draw near to the Lord, for he has heard your complaining. And as Aaron spoke to the whole congregation of the Israelites, they looked toward the wilderness, and the glory of the Lord appeared in the cloud. And the Lord spoke to Moses and said, I have heard the complaining of the Israelites. Say to them, at twilight you shall eat meat. In the morning you shall eat your fill of bread, and you shall know that I am the Lord your God. In the evening quail came up and covered the camp. And in the morning there was a layer of dew around the camp, and when the layer of dew lifted, there was on the surface of the wilderness a fine, flaky substance, as fine as frost on the ground. When the Israelites saw it, they said to one another, what is it? For they did not know what it was. Moses said to them, it is the bread that the Lord has given you to eat. This is what the Lord has commanded. Gather as much of it as each of you needs, an omer to a person, according to the number of persons, all providing for those in their own tents. The Israelites did so, some gathering more, some less. But when they measured it with an omer, those who had gathered much had nothing left over. Those who gathered little had no shortage. They gathered as much as each of them needed. And Moses said to them, let no one leave any of it over until morning. But they did not listen to Moses. Some left part of it until morning, and it bred worms and became foul. Then Moses was angry with them. Morning by morning they gathered it as much as they needed, but when the sun grew hot, it melted. On the sixth day they gathered twice as much food, 2 omers apiece. When all the leaders of the congregation came and told Moses, he said to them, this is what the Lord has commanded. Tomorrow is a day of solemn rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. Bake what you want to bake and boil what you want to boil, and all that is left over put aside to be kept until morning. So they put it aside until morning, as Moses commanded them. And it did not become foul, and there were no worms in it. Moses said, eat it today, for today is a Sabbath to the Lord. Today you will not find it in the field. 6 days you shall gather, but on the 7th day, which is the Sabbath, there will be none. When we read these stories about the Hebrew people, it is really tempting to come down on them. Yep, they blew it again. One more time, they showed that God, well, they just have no faith. But the more I think about their situation, the more sympathetic I become to them. And the more I think, yeah, maybe they really didn't blow it so badly. Maybe they don't quite deserve the derision that I first wanted to heap on them. Think about it for a minute. They had been in slavery for generations. And as slaves, they literally made no decisions for themselves. They didn't decide where they worked. They didn't decide what they did once they started working. They didn't decide when they rested and when they worked. They didn't decide what they ate, when they ate it, or how they ate it. They didn't even decide what clothing they would wear. Everything was decided for them by their master. Life wasn't good, but it certainly was predictable. Now, their masters had a fiduciary interest in them. If the slaves became too weak, they couldn't work. If you worked the slaves too long or too hard, suddenly their efficiency would begin to drop, and at some point it became counterproductive. It was in the owner's best interest to make sure that they were okay. And there was that fine line between putting too many resources into the slaves and putting too little, but they wanted to walk that fine line because if you put too little into them, one of your very expensive possessions became less worthwhile. So they didn't have all the food they wanted, perhaps, and certainly didn't have the choices of food that they might have liked, but they had enough. They worked long and hard hours. They worked 7 days a week, 365 days a year, but the masters were careful not to push too hard, because if they did, they ended up losing. Now, we have to remember, too, that all of the population of Egypt, almost all of the population of Egypt, lived literally within the sight of the Nile River. It's kind of like California. What's 80% of the population lives within 35 miles of the coast? Something like that. Well, it's even more radical than that. Because they lived in a place that was, frankly, even more arid than where we live. And they needed water. The Nile doesn't dry up like our rivers here. It gets smaller and bigger through the year, but there was always water there, and so they lived close enough to it that they had access to it. They could see, if they turned the other way and looked away from the Nile, they could see the desert. They could see that wilderness, not that far away, but that was a place that was filled with fear, because that was where you found wild animals, robbers, lawlessness, and the lack of all of the daily necessities. And we put the Hebrew people here in this situation, and they didn't even really know how to take care of themselves. Remember, they made no decisions for themselves in civilization. Put them out in the desert, and they were completely and absolutely unprepared to care for themselves. They had no idea how you would live out there. And then along comes Moses. And he's another unknown quantity. He shows up in Egypt, and they hear stories traveling through their little community about this guy calling for the Israelites to be set free, but they don't know who he is. They hear stories of miracles and of confrontations in Pharaoh's court, but they don't know what's going on really. And then, before they know what's happened, they get word they're to gather their belongings because they are marching into the desert. That same desert that has always been the place of fear. And the story tells us that Moses was a shepherd, not a group of people who were known for having good people's skills. And he was going to be their leader. And they weren't sure they trusted God. For generations, they had been in slavery. They knew the stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, but they were just stories that they heard. Their ancestors had cried out for help from God, literally for generations, and none had come. Why in the world would they trust God now? Why would they trust this God whom they really weren't sure they had any reason to trust? They'd given up praying, most of them. They'd given up hoping. Many of them even dreaming long ago. And now, for some crazy reason, Moses shows up and says, God has sent me to set you free, and we're going to march out into the desert. So here they were. They were, by today's scripture, in an environment with which they were not familiar, making decisions that they were unprepared to make, following a leader they didn't know, heading towards a land they had never seen, being asked to trust in a God whom they thought had let them down for generations. I can understand why they would complain. It's no wonder they looked back at Egypt through rose-colored glasses. Yes, Moses held up a vision for something better, a land of milk and honey where they would own the means of production, where their labor would be for themselves, where the future would be bright and beautiful. But getting there involved stepping into the unknown. It involved trusting in God. It involved following Moses. It involved being in a place they had no skills to survive. And they weren't sure that they really wanted it. Going back to slavery at least meant predictable meals. It meant a future that was out of their control, but at least a future which they could see. And that sounded attractive. And so they complained. Did God bring us out here to die? Can't we just go back? And of course, they couldn't go back. But they also didn't know how to go forward. And so the story tells us in today's passage that God meets their need. God hears their complaining and says, oh, okay. Each evening, the quail will come in and they will cover the camp, and you'll have more meat than you could possibly want. And in the mornings, this manna will fall from heaven, and you will gather it and have bread for the day. God will care for you. Each person will be able to have enough, but not too much. And each will have their fill. If you try to gather more than you need and keep it for the next day, you'll wake that day only to discover that it has rotted. So those who gather too much, you won't have too much. Those who gather too little, somehow something miraculous will happen, and there will be an omer for each person in the household, regardless of how hard they've worked that day. And then, added to that is another test. You gather for one day, you have enough. You trust that God will provide on that next day. Your daily bread will be there. The future will be secure because God, not because of your work or your planning. And then comes the Sabbath day, and the day before that, you go out and you're supposed to gather for 2 days. And now we've already learned that if you have too much, it's going to rot. But come the Sabbath day, it will not have rotted, and there will be enough for the second day, and you're not supposed to work that day. Not supposed to work. That is something unique in the history of the world. No other culture, no other people, anywhere, ever, has said, you know what, we're going to take a day off. And not only are we going to take a day off, God is going to command us to take a day off. And this is happening here in today's passage before they've gotten the 10 Commandments. They haven't gotten the commandment that says, you shall observe the Sabbath day and keep it holy because the Lord your God is. That hasn't happened yet. This is in God's plan even before then. You are going to take a day when you don't work. Period. And you're going to set this day aside as a holy day to rest in God's blessings and to be together as a community. Well, it's a wonderful story. It's a wonderful passage. But when I read this passage, I have to come away from it thinking this is one of the most foreign experiences in the Bible that we could possibly look at. Our circumstances are as different as they could be. You and I can't imagine what life is like as slaves. We can't imagine what it would be like to be completely on our own in an environment about which we have learned literally nothing, and which everything we've learned makes no sense. That's just completely foreign to us. Indeed, when we look at ourselves, most of us think of ourselves as being pretty much self-sufficient. Now, obviously, we could argue about what that means and say, you're not really self-sufficient. You require all of these connections. There's these economic systems that go all around the world, and we rely on all of that, and that's true. But the reality is that we take care of ourselves. We've planned for the future. We have 401ks and 403bs. We purchase properties with mortgages, and there is a sense, both on our part and on the folk who've lent us the money, that we're going to be able to pay that for some time. And if we don't have a mortgage and we have a rental property, someone is renting that to us with the expectation that every month we're going to come up with enough money to pay for it as long as our lease requires. We have health insurance, and we pay for that, because we're expecting that one of these days we're going to need it. Or we might, and we certainly don't want to be caught without it. We trust that we're safe because we've done the things we need to do to make that happen. That we will have enough food not only today, but tomorrow. If we had to eat all of the food that was in our house today, I would be really in bad shape. And if one day this week we decide not to go out and go to the grocery store, we'll be okay. We have adequate water, in spite of the fact that we live in a place where rain? Oh yeah, I think I remember what that was. We have shelter from the elements. And not just shelter, we live in comfortable places. And I don't know about, I do know about you. I feel pretty secure. I don't worry about tomorrow, really. And I certainly don't worry about today, really. Any anxieties that we do feel tend to be less intimate, less immediate. And that's nothing like what the Hebrew people were feeling in today's passage. They were afraid, and they had reason to be afraid. They were anxious, and they had reason to be anxious. I don't know what that feels like, really. And as I read this passage, and what in the world do you do with a story like this then? What does it have to say to people like you and me who don't live like that at all? And there are a couple of ways you can go with it. We could be completely irresponsible, and we could say that, well, if we really want to believe this passage, if we want to read this and believe the Bible, that we don't need to make any plans for the future. You know, the story of the ant and the grasshopper, and the one who stores up stuff for the future and the other one who doesn't. And we could be the one who stores up nothing, because that's what the Bible says. Indeed, if you store up stuff, it's just going to rot, and it just shows you're not trusting in God. We could go that way, and it's really not dishonest to the passage. It's not. We could push it in another way, and I could argue that this passage and other passages in the Old Testament push us not to democratic socialism, but to socialism full-blown. It doesn't matter whether you work a little or a lot, everybody gets just what they need, nothing more and nothing less. We could go in one of those directions. I'm not going to. And I think those are honest ways to read the passage and struggle with it. But there's another piece that is equally foreign to me, and I think to you as well, that I think is important to wrestle with, and that is this issue of Sabbath. It's not the first time it comes up in Scripture, because we know when God creates, in the beginning, God does 6 days of work and then says, you know what, I'm going to rest. So it shows up there. But this is before it's codified. This is before it becomes God's law for us. And it's foreign as it can be. Some of us here remember blue laws, right? You all remember blue laws. Yeah, a couple of younger folk are going, huh? There was a time when it was illegal for stores to be open on Sunday. Basically, the only thing that was open were restaurants. Yeah. And families spent time together on Sundays. I remember when I was a kid, every Sunday we went to church, and after church we went to Nana's house. She had this big, monstrous old Victorian house, and the women would go into the kitchen, which was big, all the women could fit, and they cooked. And the men would sit in the living room, and they would watch whatever sports happened to be on at that point. And of course, it was Pittsburgh, so what I remember, 12 months out of the year was go Stillers. And the kids would kind of run around, and we did whatever it was we did. But that was what we did every Sunday. And every Sunday, we had roast beef and mashed potatoes. Yeah, that was English. And some green vegetable and a salad. That's what we did. That's what we did. That sounds quaint, doesn't it? And it sounds really, really foreign to us. Nothing's closed on Sundays anymore. Some of us get a little miffed when we want to go to Costco and we discover they closed early on Sunday. And I missed it. For the most part, it's just one more day. Just one more day. If we're off work, and some of us are, but not all of us on Sundays, if we're off work, it's a day to do all of those tasks that we didn't get done earlier in the week because we had other things pulling us away. So we do laundry, we do cleaning, we do groceries, we do our honey-do list, we do all of that stuff because it's the one day when we have time to do the other work. Obviously, those of us who are here, we chose to come to church, but when we leave here, it's not going to be a Sabbath day. It's going to be just one more day in the week. Now, it's not helpful or realistic to call for a Sabbath the way that Orthodox Jews observe it, or even to think we should think in terms of blue laws. Even if the stores aren't closed, we should never go shopping on Sunday. That's not realistic for us, is it? It's not realistic to expect that, it doesn't matter that we didn't have time to do our laundry this week. We're not going to do it on Sunday either, and if this week my clothes are all stinky, so what? That's not realistic. But I think underneath the literal read of this idea of Sabbath is one that is doable and is more critical for us to wrestle with. That we still need, literally we need, it's built into human being, we need to take time for God. We need to take time for friends. We need to take time for family. We need to take time where we push aside the work of life and just be. And we don't do that very often. Now, it's kind of fun. I was at a conference not too long ago. Excuse me. A conference not too long ago with Human Good, the company that runs Via Verde. And one of the big problems they're having is finding adequate workers. And there's a whole bunch of reasons for it, but one of the things they talked about was the fact that younger workers are doing something different than folk did in my generation. My generation, we asked about salary and benefits. Younger generations ask about salary and benefits and time. And it's a problem. I've seen it with my own family. And Alexis, there was a period when she worked for a university in in Arizona, and we were talking about once, and someone at one point had asked her, they needed some task done, and they asked her if she would come in on Saturday, and she said no. And I'm a different generation. My reaction to that was, what? Your boss asked you to come into work and you said no? It's a different way of looking at how that whole relationship works, isn't it? Time, for that generation, is as important as money. Probably something that my generation needed to learn and didn't learn. Now, we don't know. I can't tell you how that generation uses the time that they're so concerned about. That's a different question. But the reality is that we need that time to just be. And the anxiety really kicks in for me there. And it kicks in for most Americans in my generation. All the studies will show that very few Americans take their vacation time. I had a clergy friend who retired, and when he retired, he had built up 8 months of vacation time. Tells you how much time he took off. And if you asked Al why he never took that time off, I think he would have said, for him, if I take the time off, who's going to do what I do? And it'll all be there when I come back, and then I have to work twice as hard. It just makes it easier for me to not take time off. For others of us, we're afraid if we take time off, someone might figure out that we're expendable. Right? And so, if I take time off, they might find out that they don't need me here quite as much, and I might lose my job. Or someone else might kind of step in and do it better, and then what happens? And it's not just vacation time. Things like maternity leave causes problems. And so it's easier just to not do that, even though we feel like we want to. It feels wrong to walk away from all of the tasks that are calling us, not just the work, literal work, the paid work tasks, but all of the work tasks. It feels irresponsible to walk away and just sit down and enjoy the breeze. It feels irresponsible to make a date to sit down with some friends and have a cup of coffee or a tea or a beer or a glass of wine and just be together instead of doing all of the stuff that's calling to us. And solving the problems of the world when we're just sitting there just feels like a luxury we cannot afford. It feels self-centered to take an hour to meditate, to count our breaths, or to count our steps as we walk along the beach. When there's so much to be done. And the world, it's there. And it's calling. And it doesn't stop. And the tasks are always there. And if we don't do them, they just get to be worse. You know, you can avoid doing the laundry, but then you have more. You can avoid doing the dishes, and eventually you run out of dishes, and then what happens? But I think the lesson that I'm going to take from today's passage is that God tells us sometimes we need to take the time. Sometimes we need to say, you know what? I'm just not going to do that right now. And it's okay. I'm going to be with God. I'm going to be with family. I'm going to be with friends. I'm going to do the self-care. Sometimes you need to just let the tasks go. And when we do that, sometimes the miracle happens and God provides. Sometimes the tasks for the day get done or not. And it's okay because God provides us with our daily needs. The bread of life, the connections, the community, the love, all of that can take place. And the work, we need to know that it's okay to let it go sometimes, and that God provides.